Welcome to Research Renaissance, presented by the Karen Toffler Charitable Trust. We invite you into the stories, struggles, and breakthroughs shaping the future of human health. From cutting-edge brain science to discoveries transforming how we heal, adapt, and thrive, we explore the ideas that matter and the people behind them. Together, we look across diseases, technology, and research fields to understand not just what is changing, but why it matters for patients, families, and the future we all share. Join us as we uncover new insights, spark collaboration, and illuminate the science that can improve our lives. Welcome to Research Renaissance. I'm Deborah Westfall, your host and guide through the fascinating future of health science. Joining me today is Dr. Scott Russo, the director of the Brain Body Research Institute at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai. Today, we will discuss Scott's focus on redefining depression and anxiety as a whole body condition versus just the disorders of the brain. So welcome, Scott.
Thank you, Deborah. It's a real pleasure to be here.
So I'm looking forward to this discussion. You lead this institute, and it's just built around the idea that the body and the brain are deeply connected. What first convinced you that, mental health couldn't be understood just by studying the brain?
Yeah, it's a very good question. If I go back, I'd say 20 years in my trajectory, early on during one of my training experiences in Dallas, Texas, doing postdoctoral work, lab rat work, in the midst of understanding and studying addiction from a brain-centric biological perspective. And during that time, as a psychologist by early training, I decided to, in addition to completing this rigorous laboratory-based training, I completed a respecialization in clinical psychology. I spent a year taking courses, another year out in the field doing psychology. I was based in an inpatient drug rehab clinic, and the primary population that we worked with were indigent women. Those with very few resources, health insurance, and otherwise. And I was the primary intake psychologist. I did all of the initial interviews, worked with the psychiatrist to come up with a diagnostic plan, and then finally a treatment plan. It was a great experience. I really enjoyed it. But what I noticed was that every patient that came into the clinic, of course, had a primary drug addiction. But they also oftentimes had a secondary psychiatric condition like major depression or bipolar. And then in addition to that, they also had several, oftentimes general medical conditions that were comorbid with those. And it just struck me in the moment that what we see out in the community is not what we're seeing in our research laboratories. People have very complex health status profiles, and they all interact with one another. And it almost felt as if we were incapable of treating the brain-related disease without considering the entirety of the patient and their other comorbidities. And so that really changed. It really honed my thinking about mental illness as a whole body condition that required these integrative, multidisciplinary approaches for treatment and for research. And it's guided not just my personal life, but also heavily guided the types of research projects that we've engaged in as a group.
So describe some of the, what goes on in your lab? How do you pick the projects? What are you studying? And I'm assuming you're seeing patients, and that's informing your research. But how is this kind of different than it would be if you were studying neuroscience or if you were studying Alzheimer's?
So it's similar. There's a lot of overlap. We're a highly integrated program, and so within our laboratory, I would say about 50% of folks come in with a neuroscience background, meaning that they obtain their PhDs or master's degree in a neuroscience specific field, and the other half is a range of different expertise, including, for example, immunology, liver biology, gastrointestinal biology. And I think by creating this integrative group, putting everybody in the room together to talk about their research, they're all borrowing from one another. So, the gastroenterologist is working closely with the neurophysiologist, and they're coming up with projects that are embedded in neuroscience, but are interfacing across all these other somewhat separate disciplines. But we think they should be all considered together. It's a really wonderful environment for discovery.
Yeah.
I always think about that. Think about my primary training, and some of the most I think pleasant and useful experiences that I've had have been talking with folks way out of my field with some crazy off the wall idea, and we come back and we design an experiment, we do it, and it's really, really fun to do science that way.
Yeah. My background is engineering, and I think about the body as kind of a systems of systems, right? And that's what you're describing is multidisciplinary systems of systems. How do you pick the projects? Is that individual people are picking the projects and then they find the team, or are there overarching hypotheses that you're kind of focused on, that you're challenging, kind of the norm of what we believe about the body and the brain connection? How do you pick?
I think it's a little bit of both, if I'm honest. I think there are some overarching questions within the lab, across the institute, much of which may be derived from our past experience and research. But I, as a principal investigator, as a mentor, as a leader in that space, I try to keep a very open mind. And I think that allows for people to come in individually with unique ideas. And I think, to be completely honest with you, I think those are the most innovative projects, where somebody comes in with an idea and we kind of work together to put that into a more meaningful space. I always tell my lab members, and it is true, actually, if you look at the data, your most important discoveries usually come between the ages of 30 and 40. And so I always tell my lab members that come through, I really rely on you for innovation. I'm past 40 now, so my important thoughts are gone. I need you all to continue the mission. And so I laugh about that, but I think that's a really important thing as a mentor. You have to be able to give in, and you have to be able to let people develop, to fruit and to become their own leader. And if you don't allow that individuality in terms of projects and research questions, I don't think that ever really develops.
Yeah. Well, that makes sense. I mean, a 30-year-old, 40-year-old, they have the knowledge, they have the experience, and probably the confidence, but yet they're not so far down the road that they have fallen into some sort of rigid,
Yes.
profession. So that makes sense. A lot of times people think depression or anxiety is, purely emotional or feelings. And, how how are you thinking about this, and give us some real life examples of how that's not true. It is a physical, this body is changing our brain circuits, possibly. Can you give us some examples of that?
Of course. I actually, the best example is not from me. There's a field that has studied fear, and what they've discovered over the years is that fear is really encapsulated within a brain structure called the amygdala. This is a region, for example, if you develop post-traumatic stress disorder, the amygdala is hyperactive whenever you are experiencing cues associated with your past trauma. It's very well established, if you lesion that, patients no longer exhibit what we consider to be a typical fear response. It's a very replicable finding in the literature. Several years ago, there was an interesting paper, though, in a patient that had full lesions of their amygdala, and they were still able to experience intrinsic panic and fear. And the conclusion of that is that you can sense your peripheral organs in real time. And if something is off, it still cues your brain and it can cause an emotional response to it. It can cause a fear-based response, even though the brain, tissue, the brain foundation still doesn't exist. I think we all experience this at some level. I mean, have you ever been, when I was younger, going out on my first date, I had butterflies in my stomach, and that really was a sensation. That's the precipitant of the emotion. And so I think when you start to really consider how your body feels associated with certain emotional states or experiences, it becomes clear that many of our emotions actually start in the body and then become consolidated in the brain. And our ability to experience those emotions does require brain tissue. I'm not trying to make the claim that the brain is unimportant, but a lot of times those emotions do start deep in our belly, so to speak.
Yeah. So we have, and there's other researchers that are kind of looking at, disease specific, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, ALS. And some of the really interesting science is it may not start in the brain. It may start in the gut. It may, start in something that in our immune system, our lymphatic system. You know, how are you guys thinking about this, specifically around, depression and anxiety? But the more we know, how is that structuring the research?
Yeah. So we think, I mean, the research program that I run is very focused on the idea that inflammation may be at the root of all of these diseases. And, we got into this area for a couple of reasons. I mentioned my early experiences in clinical psychology training. But when you start to look at the data, human patient populations, every brain disease that we've characterized, whether it be Parkinson's, Alzheimer's on the neurodegeneration side of it, or depression, PTSD, schizophrenia on the psychiatry end of it, every one of those disorders is associated with very large increases with comorbid risk for other diseases. So, for example, if you have depression, a post-traumatic stress disorder, you're far more likely to develop a bowel disorder like irritable bowel. You're much, much more likely to develop coronary artery disease. If you have a heart attack and you're depressed, the mortality rates are exponentially higher. And it got me thinking, like, it can't just be behavioral choices. People are arguing, well, if you're depressed, maybe you don't engage in self-care, and then your physical organs, suffer as a result. Even when you control for that, it doesn't account for this really high risk in comorbidity. And so that really pushed us to start to think about reasons why. And if you look at what's shared amongst all of those illnesses, it's disturbances in the immune system, it's heightened inflammation. So we've now begun to try to convince the field that maybe it's not always in the brain, and that if we look outside of the brain, we could not only discover new causes, but we could also access potentially new treatment modalities that are far more easy to access than what we're currently working with. And what I mean by that is whenever we try to develop a new therapy for, say, depression, and drug therapy, so to speak, but whenever we do that, we screen a bunch of compounds and we find a couple that work well, maybe, and then we look at the chemical structures, and unfortunately, they don't cross the blood-brain barrier and never actually get into the brain, and we kill those compounds. They don't make it into development. What we're saying is maybe that's not always the case. And what if we have a signal in the periphery, like an immune cell or an inflammatory molecule, that we could just simply sequester and prevent it from getting to the brain? It would open up a whole new class of medications and therapeutics development. We as a field haven't necessarily gotten to that space, but that's definitely an area where I think we'd love to see more push and more acknowledgement. But of course, we also need more researchers.
Yeah.
We still don't know what we need to know about.
Is there growth in the amount of inflammation that people are that have, or because of environmental or journey of life, or is it that we just have an increased awareness that it exists? And I'm really asking that question: is there more nowadays? And what is the reason of more? Is it awareness or could it be environmental?
Yeah, no, that's a really very good question. Only we fully know the answer to it, but I suspect that it's a combination of factors. There's definitely an awareness component, and I think back to like 2020, or maybe even before 2020 when I would give talks about this. And we've been working on it since the early in 2010s, and people really engaged with what I was saying, but there was less of a direct experiential understanding of it. I think COVID changed that. And in the early days, I don't know if you remember this, but there was a lot of talk about the cytokine surge that was experienced with those early variants, I think the Delta variant in particular. Then there was several case studies where prominent case studies, like I think there's a physician in DC maybe, who developed severe psychosis or severe depression as a result of their infection. And I think that really was the piece that made the broader population aware that maybe inflammation or an immune response to something like a virus could in fact be driving some of these brain diseases. But it's not just that. And you mentioned toxins in the environment. I think that we live in an environment that we don't control very well anymore. And there's so many things to worry about. And we still know so little about how those things impact our bodies. I'm on a big microplastic kick these days. I'm trying to get all plastics out of my diet at some level that I can control. We don't really know what the long-term consequences of microplastics are, but I can't imagine it's good for our immune systems.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
those things really scare me, and those are the things that you just don't know about.
Yeah, and it's hard too, right? Just try to get plastics out of your life.
It's so hard to.
It's so hard. Everything. Um, you're focused on depression, anxiety, body, brain. Um, what is your thoughts on the suicide rates that are just going up? Is you know Yes, the world is complicated. Yes, there's changes economically and there's a lot of political and a lot of changes. But is this more maybe a physical that's happening?
It certainly could be. Suicidality is so sad. It's something that, from a clinician's perspective, we have very little control over. There's a few things now I think that psychiatrists, definitely psychiatrists having their toolbox to kind of address that risk, rapid acting antidepressants. But it's not getting better. And I think that there has been less investigation into what distinguishes brain body mechanisms between, say, a person that has depression versus a person that has depression with suicidality, which is different, I believe. There is some hints, and one, we have, this is like early days of the study, but there was some evidence possibly that there's a more permissive interaction between the periphery and the brain in patients with major depression that also had suicidality. They didn't complete it, but they had either suicidal ideation or an attempt itself. So it's very possible that there is differences. There's an increase in the way in which peripheral compartments can talk to the brain, and that's heightened in cases where suicidality is an issue. But we don't know a lot about it. It's a very good question.
What is when you say peripheral? What does that mean?
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
So factors that are in blood in circulation can more readily, potentially more readily access the brain itself under states of depression with high suicidality.
That's interesting because there's something that's going on at the blood-brain barrier that may not be cleaning or protecting the brain. That's very interesting.
Yes. So we'd love
Yeah.
to dig deeper into that. It's such a critical need. I think, suicide is one of those situations. I mean, we talk about all these conditions, and really, suicide across mental illness is the biggest issue that we face in mental health treatment, mental health research. We don't have a lot of good ways to prevent it, especially from a biological perspective.
Yeah. Yeah, what is the statistics for the vets? It's 12 to 17 vets take their life every minute. It's just, it's really incredible. And, it's that connection back to, well, if it's inflammation or something that's going on in the body, and now there's something that maybe the blood-brain barrier just can't handle because of there's just more or it's different. That possible connection is kind of, it's just very interesting. So
I tell you, there was a series of studies. I forget the author, so I apologize, but there was a series of studies in patients with traumatic brain injury, veterans that had been around a blast during war, and they noticed that they had peripheral or organ system disturbances. For example, I think there's an increased risk of gastrointestinal disturbances in patients with TBI. And so those correlative studies in humans were very interesting, but there was a couple of studies in rodents where they can actually go in and use invasive tools to understand why trauma or degeneration in a brain region from TBI could lead to a peripheral organ disease. And it turns out that the nerve cells in the region where the TBI was focused, under healthy states, they actually send neurons, neural connections down to those organs and can innervate them directly. And so when you remove that, you're removing some degree of brain control over your bowels. And that's what they think, at least in a mouse, they showed that that's what's causing some of these disturbances. It's just fascinating. It's not something I would have ever thought about, but it really does position, veterans, mental health related issues, TBI, all together in this brain body ecosystem that can't be ignored. And I don't think that any of the current treatments consider that connection or those connections.
yeah. Yeah, I had a gentleman a couple weeks ago. His research focus, he's a neurosurgeon, and his focus is on the vagus nerve and how, that central control mechanism is, throughout the whole body, back and forth. And we don't know enough about it to, even start to think about, like, is there treatments or therapeutics or things that we can do there that kind of help.
I'm very encouraged by the Vegas and the research around it. In fact, we had Kevin Tracy come speak here at Mount Sinai. Kevin is the I think CSO at Northwell Hofstra in Long Island. He's a neurosurgeon as well, and he's really written the book on vagus nerve and vagus nerve stimulation as a therapeutic. And it is, that you can buy over-the-counter devices. You can flip them onto your lapel. My wife has one, in fact. But there's implantable versions, kind of like a pacemaker, that require a minor surgery. The data looks amazing. And it's not just for mental illness, right? There's really good data that vagal nerve stimulation can improve depression, but it can also improve other diseases that we know are comorbid with depression. Like, for example, autoimmune arthritis, like rheumatoid. There's potential for cardiovascular disease. I think it's really exciting. It's somewhat non-invasive. It doesn't require pharmacology. It's a device. It's well tolerated. There was not a single adverse event in the trial that they recently performed using these these inserted pacemaker ENS devices. Just really, really very exciting.
Yeah.
Engineer,
Yeah.
or you appreciate that.
Yeah, because not everything needs to be a pharmaceutical because there's downside of that too. We don't always understand the unintended consequences of trying to address one problem and it creates another problem. Like you said, we're highly connected and highly individual. So, if there's a way to get to more, uh, very precision, the better it is. Yeah. So you've studied stress and how people bounce back. What do you think some of the kind of the separate vulnerabilities for resistance for, at the biological level, because we all are very different. Like, how do we think about this, or where is the science in thinking about this?
Yeah. I don't know if I have the best answer. I can tell you kind of my thought process, and some of the data is still a little bit um, unclear, but it is multifactorial. There's definitely genetic linkages, but the genetics are complicated. They're polygenic, meaning that it's a lot of different genes. It's a lot of small or minor mutations in a lot of genes rather than like a big mutation of one gene. And so it makes it hard to really study those and understand the genetic contribution. Some people have estimated, and this is where the science is a little swishy, that maybe as little as 30% of depression and anxiety risk is from our genetics. That means that 70% is probably from our experiences that we have over our lifetime.
Wow.
So again, I don't know, those estimates are a little squishy, but I do believe that the majority of our risk comes from our environmental exposures. And when you start to think about environmental exposures, that's where things get really interesting and complicated. And we don't have good ways of really time stamping our experiences and saying, you know what, that was the experience that led to my depression. PTSD is a little bit different because we typically do have a single isolated event that we can map that back to. But for depression, it's much more difficult. And a good example is there is absolutely correlations between early exposures to certain viruses, early infections, and later risk for mental illness. But we don't know how to quantify that across the lifespan. So if you're coming into the clinic 20 years later, how do we know that it's that exposure that you had 20 years ago that really led to this risk? And this is not just true for depression; it's true for a lot of illnesses of the immune system that interact with the brain. There was a recent paper out maybe last year or the year before that showed that an exponentially higher number of patients that develop multiple sclerosis could be attributed, their MS could be attributed to Epstein-Barr exposure. And so when you start to see data like that, you start to think, well, how much of brain diseases are from these exposures? What is my exposome that's driving my developmental trajectory and leading to, either a healthy brain or a susceptible brain.
Yeah. And how do you know when you've been exposed? I mean, I think about all the travel. I mean, I was a consultant that was on an airplane for basically 30 years. And every day I was exposed to everything. How would you ever identify that?
It's the challenge. And I think that it's really impacted the types of progress that we've made in the field with trying to understand what are the various factors that are driving wellness. And I think that, I mean, I hate to say it, but I think a lot of our therapies reflect that. We're putting Band-Aids on problems. We're not fixing problems.
Yeah.
So, we need to find strategies to be able to be better historians as researchers of our past patient history. And so, maybe in the era of big data, we have an opportunity to do that. I am optimistic. Maybe that's our 10-year plan.
Yeah. Yeah, I was going to ask you about AI and some of the maybe, these massive databases and the ability to go through. All sorts of questions come to my mind about now privacy and, how do you even collect that journey of life, with people. Um, the resilience question's interesting to me. Is resilience, just for healthy life, but there's groups of these people that age, these super agers, and some of them are physical super agers. They're running marathons at the age of 90. Some of them are mental, cognitive super agers. Do you study this? Is there any correlation between depression, anxiety, mental health with super agers?
Yes, really good question. It's a very interesting question. Um, the we are kind of starting to think about that question a little bit more in detail. Um, I have one of the scientists that joined my group last year came from an aging lab, and what he did as a graduate student was to take um, blood protein signatures from thousands and thousands of patients, and or not, I'm sorry, not patients, people, subjects, just across the lifespan. And he used advanced machine learning algorithms to develop a way to take each protein that he found in blood across the lifespan. And first and foremost, he mapped it. He was able to map it to a very specific organ. So he was able to come up with a list of heart specific proteins, all in blood, mind you. So these are things that are being dumped into our blood circulation. But he came up with a list. He had brain proteins, immune cell proteins, and he could then develop an organ aging signature. So he could tell you, not not based on your biological age, but based on the proteins in your blood, what's the actual age of your heart versus your immune system. And then he subcategorized each of those into risk factors. The nice thing about his study was that it was longitudinal, so he was able to, you know, track those subjects out 10, 15 years and get mortality rates on all of them. He was able to show that, certain organs of our body play an outsized role in the risk or resilience of that individual. The brain and the immune system were the top predictors of mortality. So if you had an old brain and an old immune system, you were far more likely to die in the next 10, 15 years than those that had a younger, more resilient version of it. So this was his graduate work. And one of the things that we're interested in actually is whether stress conditions like depression and anxiety are predictors or are precipitants of early aging. Does having an illness like this not cause you to be a super ager, but cause you to age in more negative ways, more rapidly? And then conversely, this is what we've struggled with, is your question is, can we identify patients that are subjects that are more resilient in the more resilient pool and see how that protects them? The main issue is that when we have patients come through, the way that we determine risk or resilience is usually obviously by a diagnostic measure, but also by a historical measure. How much, for example, trauma have you experienced? And we don't get enough of those subjects that have had severe traumas but are resilient and that we can study in order to ask that question. But it's a really important, in my view, it's a really important question, because what we're ultimately looking for is to age healthy and with dignity, right? We want to be happy. We want to be able to take a walk or go on a vacation as we age. We don't want to be, in a wheelchair or having to live day to day, doctor by doctor, And so to really get at those questions, we need to understand what are the features that allow us to age cognitively, physically, and put all that stuff together so that we can inform our patients look, this is what you really need to fix.
Yeah.
Best word, in fact, that would be great.
Yeah, well, that's, it's, and then I started thinking about just the process of some of what we gather, right? We gather brain tissue, we gather a little bit of blood, but we don't gather the tissues necessarily in these banks to be able to look at all these connections. So just even the process of our research needs to keep up with the hypotheses or the learning that we have here.
Absolutely, yeah. The lack of availability. I mean, it's a plug for organ tissue donation. I've got mine set up on my license for sure. But that is a real limitation. I think is that the access to broad arrays of tissues to do these types of biomarker discovery studies are just lacking. We have blood oftentimes, and maybe a couple of brain banks. Wouldn't it be amazing? I always think about this. If when we donated our bodies, we donated all of our organs, and scientists could study all of our organs together and come up with brain body signatures of health and disease in those postmortem tissue banks. We don't have those.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I was going to ask if you were to kind of redesign the process or the institution around the treatment of depression, anxiety, mental health. What would that look like? What have you learned? What do you think needs to change? And what would that look like?
I think the biggest thing that I would change, and actually I have the opportunity to start doing this at least locally within the Mount Sinai community, is that in general, we as scientists tend to be siloed into our spaces. And I mean, I learned this very much so when I began to study things outside of the brain. I realized that all of my colleagues that were studying the brain didn't really care that much about what I was saying. And so I had to find my group, my core group. And, I would find them all over the place. I found people in dermatology that said, "We got this really cool thing. We think it's brain related. Can you help us?" So I think that's one thing, is I want to be able to break down those silos. The other big problem, in my opinion, even if you have two people that are kind of on the same wavelength, for example, me as a neurobiologist and a psychologist working closely with our psychiatry colleagues to ask important questions about mental health, we oftentimes don't integrate very well. And there's structural reasons for that. But, in general, there's not a lot of cross collaboration between, like, say, a clinical researcher and a basic neuroscience researcher. And I think if we could find ways of breaking down those walls and further supporting team sports, so to speak, I think that we would make tremendous progress in understanding mental health, mental illness, and coming up with better treatments. I've been successful in that space. I've got a very close friend here, runs the Depression and Anxiety Center, and we've been working together for 20 years. We've built biorepositories together. We've published 30 papers together. And I think if I could get every basic scientist in my department to find their clinical partner, their clinical alter ego, I think that would be a win.
Yeah. The research institution isn't set up for that, though. If you look at how grants are funded, I was shocked to find out that for early career researchers, if there's somebody you want to collaborate with across the universities, but if you've never worked with them before, NIH probably won't give you the opportunity to they won't fund you because you're not proven. You don't know how that collaboration will work. Do you think, not to get into the politics of funding and research and all that, but do you see more philanthropy? Do you see more opportunities for that funding of collaboration? Because I agree, it's so important.
I think philanthropy is critical. I mean, a lot of times when we do start these projects, we get new collaborators, particularly if it's a kind of a clinical translational project where we're partnering with another clinical department. We usually do rely heavily on philanthropy to fund those early stage studies that would then allow us to be competitive for NIH. But you're right, it's a weird rule. Like, why does my past publication history with this individual matter that much? If we put together a compelling story and we've got a good plan, then why not fund it? So there definitely are a lot of barriers to that structure that I just mentioned. Another one, actually, that is maybe even more surprising is the structure of NIH itself with individual institutes. So I'll give you an example. We had a project in the lab that was being driven by a former postdoc, was moved on, and we were interested in understanding why stress was associated with, or depression, for example, was associated with gastrointestinal disturbances. And he did the scientist in the lab, Kenny Chan, did a beautiful job on this. Hopefully the paper will be out soon. But he showed basically that your brain kind of senses stress here. It sends signals down to your colon. And those signals cause inflammation, causes immune cells to become active. They secrete immune factors. And those immune factors break down the epithelial barrier of the gastrointestinal system. And now what you have is a permissive state. So there's holes in the gut, it's opened up, and byproducts from the bacteria in your gut can seep into your blood. And now you have a situation where you've got toxins in blood, they activate other immune cells that then go to the brain and cause a whole bunch of problems, behavioral problems. We thought this was fantastic. I sent it to a couple of program officers at the NIMH, who said, we're not really interested in the gastrointestinal system. I would send it to this other institute, NIDDK, that does that work. You send it to NIDDK, you say, we love the gut part, but just get rid of the brain part. We don't really care about that. So even the structure of our institutes are siloed and separated. It can be very challenging to put together these integrated programs and then factor in different species, like human and animal grants never fly. It's a very challenging thing. I think we do need structural changes at the NIH to be able to fund these things on a much larger scale. But in the meantime, philanthropy has definitely filled in those gaps and has helped a lot of labs, not just here, but elsewhere, to build these programs towards NIH funding. But
Yeah.
be true.
Yeah, we need up in the different areas, but we also need the across these different functions, these different questions. We're learning so much in totality. So when you look out 5, 10, 15 years from now, where do you think we're going to be with the science, the research, the therapeutics, whatever they may be? What do you think, or maybe what do you hope? And
I'm optimistic. I hope, but I also think that we will be far more integrative as a field. I think there's a recognition of the themes that we've discussed today as being critically important, and there's more and more buy-in across the scientific community, and I think that is starting to bleed into major funding institutes like NIH. I'm very happy about the vote on the budget yesterday. I think that I'm optimistic that our world-class research system will continue to be the best in the world. But I think that I'm most optimistic about the idea that we're going to have new classes of antidepressant, antipsychotic, a range of medications for mental illness that are not traditionally operating on the assumptions that we've held as a field, that we have to normalize, for example, neurotransmitter imbalance. I think there's going to be a new immune modulatory therapeutic for subsets of patients with depression in the next 10 years that will be approved. And I think that we'll continue to, make amazing strides in the therapeutic domains that we've been studying. But I do think that we need some paradigm shifts with some new strategies, new therapies, and I think we'll have them in the next 10 years.
Yeah. So what is the question I didn't ask that is important for me to ask that I just didn't know I should have asked?
Yeah, this is always the hardest question. I need to think about that for 1 second. You asked so many great questions. I think if I were to write a list of my interview questions for me, I would spend almost 100% in line with you. I think maybe I'll make a comment about something that I am a little bit concerned about. Maybe this is a thought that we can go on. Despite what I just said about the optimism, one of the things that I am slightly pessimistic about is that even though we're back on track, the past year or two of uncertainty has really weighed on our trainee pool. I as a PI, as a mentor, I've been doing this now for almost 20 years, and every generation predominantly is so enthusiastic about continuing their careers in science once they finish either their PhD or their postdoctoral training or medical physician scientist training. And that's changing rapidly and dramatically. And I worry that we're using some of the key young thinkers in our space. And, depending upon how much longer the uncertainty lasts, we can bounce back now, but if it lasts much longer, we might end up with a pool that's just too small to continue our excellence in medical research. So that's something that really does worry me a lot. And I'm not sure we have a good, we're talking about it, but I don't think we have a good strategy to address it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. And I think I share the same concern, right? If we look at other points in history, I know nuclear is controversial to some people, but when we quit funding that, even the military, there was such a gap in just even the know-how of, even if we wanted to bring it back. And then you get into the geopolitics of the research and where people are going and where that growth is. And so I share that concern with you too. No. I really appreciate your time. This has been fantastic. I love what you're doing. And how would people find you? And if they want to fund you, if they want to fund some of your early career researchers, how do they find you?
You can type in Scott Russo Brain Body Research Institute. We have several websites. There is a link for donations on our Brain Body Research Institute website. My email address is readily available online. You can reach out directly, or you can talk to more development.
There you go.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Deborah, I've had a wonderful conversation with you. Thank you for having me.
I appreciate your time. Thank you for doing what you're doing. Thank you for joining Research Renaissance. For more information and to stay updated, subscribe for more episodes and visit our website at tofflertrust.org. Feel free to call us if you have any thoughts, suggestions, or just want to find out more about the Karen Toffler Charitable Trust. Until we meet again, onward and upward.